we're going to get started now. I'm just going to do a brief introduction here for Dr. Jonathan McClatchy, whom I've had the privilege of knowing for, oh gosh, I forget how many years now. I first met him in the US at a conference in North Carolina through a friend of mine who's an apologist, Frank Turek, at an event. And at that stage, he was still working on his PhD in Scotland. And he's gone on to finish his PhD. His background is in science and biology, but he almost has a greater passion for apologetics and Christianity, and his passion for the New Testament and the historical Jesus, the case for the resurrection, is few people I've met who have as much zeal for the subject as this man does. Is extremely knowledgeable in this area as well. And I believe he's also been studying theology at the same time as having attained his PhD. He works with the Discovery Institute in the US, which is on the West Coast in Seattle. And they are arguably one of the best organizations in terms of really delving into the big debates going on in the culture. They've got the faith and science debates, discussions in evolution and intelligent design, but they deal with many other issues there. So we have a number of students who are going to be enrolled in the Summer Institute with the Discovery Institute this year. It's an intensive program that we offer to students. And so you've missed the chance to catch that bus this year, but you can, if you're around next year, you certainly can participate in that as well. It's an amazing program. I commend it to all of you. In the old days, they used to handpick students, and they used to fly people to Seattle. And most students are up for that, a paid flight to Seattle, a 2 weeks accommodation, and then in the US. Pierre was one of the lucky few, okay, who got to do that. And Pierre can confirm what a tremendous impact that had on his life. Nowadays, because they have got digital platforms, they don't do that anymore. But one of the reasons why we do is we can train more people, and by doing this work online. So that's a program that they run with the Discovery Institute. I think, Jonathan, do you teach in that program at all?
I will be doing a session this year. This will be my first time.
So he'll be one of the lecturers on that. Jonathan, for interest's sake, is married. They've also just got a new son, Daniel, who's 8 months old. And so I was just asking about his family. And Jonathan is the real deal. He not only studies these things, but he goes into the public arenas. And he has carried out a number of debates here in South Africa and overseas in the field of God and science. He has debated Peter Atkins. For those of you who study science, Peter Atkins has written many of the textbooks that you use here in your science classes. He's debated him, one of the most famous atheists in the world. And he's also debated a number of the top Islamic scholars in the world. People like Shabir Ali, not once, but on a number of occasions. So Jonathan has been able to engage in two hugely important areas academically, both as an academic, but also as a Christian, bearing witness to the gospel and the Lord, both in the area of the historicity of the Bible and Jesus and the resurrection and the theology associated with that, and at the same time dealing with the God and science debate. So this evening he's going to be focused on the case for a resurrection. Pierre was able to give you the version 1.0. It was the Resurrection for Dummies kind of lecture, okay? Jonathan is a walking library, and you're going to find that out now. So pay attention and hold on, okay? He is going to give you a much more thorough dealing with this amazing subject. And so since this is what you guys asked for, we decided to get Jonathan. And I'm pretty sure by the end of this, you're going to be swimming in information. But that's a good thing. It's good to become aware of how deep and rich and thick this subject is, and that there is much that we have to say about this and to the skeptical world. Jonathan, that's my introduction for you, buddy. Over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me to speak. So as Simon said, I'm going to be speaking this evening on the case for the resurrection of Jesus, let me just briefly introduce myself. You can find my website at jonathanmcclatchy.com. That website houses a lot of my articles, links to my videos, and updates about upcoming events and that kind of thing. So if you want to find out more about me, you can go to jonathanmcclatchy.com. You can also contact me at jonathan@talkaboutdoubts.com. If you would like a copy of my slides, send me an email and I'll be happy to give you a copy of those. I can also send you a resource list where you can learn more about some of the information you're going to be finding out about this evening. And so yeah, if you want resources and PDFs of some of the books that are in the public domain and the slide deck, then please send me an email and I'll be happy to send those along. So I also want to mention my other website, which is talkaboutdoubts.com, which is a service I launched in 2021. We basically offer a free private mentoring service to Christians who are wrestling with doubts about faith, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether there's a rational path back to faith. So if anyone in the audience is in that category, struggling with doubts about faith or has left the faith and wants to explore whether there's a rational path back to the Christian faith, then please feel free to reach out at talkaboutdoubts.com. There's a contact form there. Just fill that out with your name and email address and the best time for you to meet to talk, and give a summary of your questions and doubts and concerns. And one of our specialists will be in touch with you by email to set up a private Zoom call to talk about your doubts with you in confidence. And we have specialists in diverse academic disciplines, from New Testament scholarship, textual criticism, Old Testament scholarship, biblical archaeology, philosophy, physics, biology. We have psychologists, and pastors, and so forth. And so the idea is that we are able to connect people who are struggling with doubts with specialists who are experts in the particular area that people are wrestling with. So please feel free to avail yourself of that resource if you think it would be helpful for you as well. So you might have come across the argument from the minimal facts case for the resurrection of Jesus. And the minimal facts case is a very popular approach to making the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. It's pioneered by Gary Habermas and his colleague, Dr. Michael Licona. And in order for, so the minimal facts case is trying to establish the case for the resurrection on the basis of only those facts which are not only supported by evidence, but also held by a high majority of New Testament critical scholars across the theological spectrum. So Gary Habermas, for example, says 90-something% of scholars have to hold a particular fact in order for him to appeal to it in his minimal facts case for the resurrection. So it must have scholars, including skeptics across the current ideological spectrum, who agree with that fact. And this is part of the methodology and is treated as having epistemic significance. So 3 facts to satisfy the minimal facts criteria. Very soon afterwards, Jesus decided experiences that they believed were appearances of the resurrected Jesus. And that just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus also experienced what he thought was a post-resurrection appearance of the risen Jesus, and those are taken from Gary Habermas. There's a number of really significant problems with this popular approach to making the case for the resurrection. The most important of these problems concerns the nature of the purported appearances. What were the supposed appearances of the resurrected Jesus purportedly like? If we can't say with confidence what the purported experiences were like, it becomes very difficult to evaluate the rationality of the disciples' interpretation of what they allegedly experienced. So here are some of the limitations that are placed on the appearance fact. It does not mean that the appearances were like those described in detail in the gospel accounts. Not enough scholars across the ideological spectrum acknowledge that. So when Habermas or Licona are pressed with some sort of hallucinatory hypothesis to explain the experiences of the disciples, it is not uncommon for Licona or Habermas to reach for the group experiences or the multi-sensory nature of the experiences reported by the Gospels and Acts. The problem is that that's no longer a minimal fact by their criteria, because not enough scholars across the spectrum would agree with that fact. And so the Habermas and Licona actually changed the criteria midway through the argument. And so it becomes a bit of a bait and switch, which is, I think, highly problematic. Um, okay, so it also does not mean that the disciples believed that Jesus was physically alive and appeared to them bodily. In fact, Habermas and Licona expressly treat that as a different second-order fact. What are some of the scenarios that are consistent with the appearance fact? Well, you could have a floating, non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus that appears only once, briefly, and speaks only a few words. And these scenarios are weak, or in the first case, even disconfirmatory of a bodily resurrection, right? If you imagine that you had a Jesus that hovered above the ground and you moved to touch him to feel the wound in his side or in his hands or what have you, and your hand swiped right through it, well, that would be disconfirmatory of a bodily resurrection. And so there's a problem that has been dubbed the epistemic bottleneck problem, which is to say that it doesn't matter how much evidence you adduce that the apostles believed they had experiences with the risen Jesus, or the risen Jesus had appeared to them. If you cannot say what those appearances were purportedly like, it becomes extremely difficult or impossible to actually move forward with the argument in terms of establishing that what the disciples' interpretation of what the experience was actually rational. So the central problem then with the minimal facts case is that if we're not able to say in detail what the experiences were like, it's very difficult to evaluate the rationality of the disciples' belief, even if we include the second order fact that they believed that Jesus was raised bodily. In fact, Habermas's method doesn't even seem to quantify or account for the level of confidence that the scholars he is citing have in the so-called minimal facts. So, for example, one of the scholar uses qualified language like "it may have occurred" or "that it is plausibly true." Well, he puts those in the same category as those that say that they're very confident in a particular fact. Habermas doesn't even quantify separately an acknowledgement of group appearances from an acknowledgement of individual appearances. And this is a very serious issue, since many people who present the minimal facts case assume that the statement that a majority of scholars acknowledge appearances means that they grant group appearances. And then they'll say that there's no such thing as group hallucinations and so forth. And of course, there's no one such thing as the appearances, because different scholars mean different things by the so-called appearances. There are scholars like Geza Vermes, for example, who would maintain that the disciples had visions of Jesus raised from the dead. But a vision is, if that's what the experiences were purportedly like, isn't very helpful in making the case for the resurrection. In fact, if all the disciples had was visions, you could even argue that that is evidence against a bodily, physical resurrection. So we have to be very careful, I think, with this sort of approach to making the case for the resurrection. The approach that I would put forward, in contrast to the minimal facts, is what has been called the maximal data approach to making the case for the resurrection. And this approach is basically inspired from the work of William Paley, especially his book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, published in 1794. And the maximal data approach asserts up front that the Gospel's resurrection accounts represent what the disciples claimed happened to them, and this can be supported by arguments for the reliability and origin of the Gospels in eyewitness testimony. It treats the objective vision theory as not being a claim that the resurrection occurred. Dale Allison, for example, takes the objective vision theory, which is to say that Jesus' body was moved into an alternative dimension, and the disciples are having visions of Jesus in this alternate dimension. And that I don't subscribe to the idea that that is equivalent to the claim that the resurrection of Jesus bodily occurred. In fact, Dale Allison scoffs at the idea that Jesus' resurrected body was comprised of carbon atoms and that he had kidneys and genitals and so forth in his resurrected state. The maximal data approach asserts up front that the early chapters of Acts accurately represent what the disciples were testifying, how soon and under what dangerous conditions. So what happened after Jesus' death? What are we trying to explain? Well, there's four essential hypotheses that we can evaluate and weigh in terms of what happened following Jesus' death. They give rise to the belief that Jesus had in fact been raised from the dead. One is that his immediate followers did not claim that he rose again. They would have been as surprised as anyone else to hear that Jesus had been raised from the dead. We can call, so the Gospels are later myths, and we call that the myth hypothesis. Or, second, his followers were deceived into thinking that he rose again. The most popular expression of that would be the idea of some sort of hallucination. So we can call that the hallucination hypothesis, that somehow they were honestly mistaken about what they experienced. Third, his followers deceived others into thinking that he rose again. So in other words, they lied about it. We can call this the conspiracy hypothesis. Or fourthly, he did in fact rise again. And so we can call this the resurrection hypothesis. Now, let me summarize then the case for the resurrection as I would present it. And as I said before, this is inspired by William Paley, particularly his book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity. First, we possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive. Second, the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived. Third, the circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceivers. Finally, therefore, the most probable explanation is that the content of their testimony is true. So let's have a look at these propositions in turn. Let's start with the first one. We possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive. Now, there's a number of different ways that one can approach making the case for this, but I'm just going to give you one, and that is to do with the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, in chapter number 2, we read about Peter's speech at Pentecost in Jerusalem. And we read in Acts 2, brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses. Moreover, so this is Peter's speech at Pentecost, about 50 days removed from Jesus' crucifixion. In chapter 10 of Acts, we read Peter's speech to Cornelius, the Gentile. And Peter tells Cornelius they put him, Jesus, to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who had been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And so not only does Peter and the other 11 who were standing up with Peter at Pentecost to proclaim the resurrection, not only do these individuals claim to have witnessed an appearance of the resurrected Christ, or multiple appearances of the resurrected Christ, but they also claim to have eaten and drunk with him after he rose from the dead. What are some of the other details supplied by Luke in Acts? Well, Jesus appeared multiple times to individuals and groups. To Simon Peter individually, we learn in Luke 24:34, to Cleopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus, to the disciples and those gathered with them. Jesus ate broiled fish in the presence of the disciples and those who were with them. The post-resurrection experiences involved extended discourses, including a Bible study with Jesus, where he opens the scriptures and explains the things in Moses and the prophets concerning himself. The resurrection appearances took place over a 40-day time period, according to Acts 1:3. So it wasn't just one brief and confusing episode. And so the question then becomes, do these claims that we read of in Luke Acts actually reflect what the purported witnesses of the resurrection themselves said? Does this reflect the claims of the original apostles? Because if it does, then we can go on to evaluate why they made the sorts of claims that they did, considering the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters. So for this first part of the argument, all I'm trying to establish is that this does in fact reflect what the original witnesses said. Now you might ask, well, can we trust Luke Acts to be giving us an accurate report of what the original apostles said concerning the nature and variety and duration of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus? Well, let me apply two tests to this question. The first of those is that Luke Acts says that it is grounded in eyewitness testimony with Jerusalem witnesses. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And secondly, that the author reliably worked with Paul and so was present at the Jerusalem church. First, then, let's turn to this first contention. Let's go to the prologue of Luke's gospel. Luke opens up his gospel by addressing his patron, Theophilus, and says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." And so the author of Luke Acts claims to have received information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And in fact, there's some good arguments to think that Luke is not merely talking about having read written sources from eyewitnesses, but that he's actually spoken with and conversed with or interviewed eyewitnesses. If you want to see the full argument for that, I would recommend reading Luc van de Veke's book, Living Footnotes in the Gospel of Luke. I believe it's the first chapter where he makes that, where he lays out that case. But so with that in mind, then let's turn to the 21st chapter of the book of Acts, where we read, this is among those so-called we passages in Acts. If you've read the book of Acts, you'll be familiar with the so-called we passages, which kick off in chapter 16, the most face value interpretation of which is that the author was actually claiming to be a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, because he starts to use the inclusive plural pronoun we. We did this, we did that, etc. And now in chapter 21, it says, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present." And so notice that that Luke is claiming to be present with Paul when Paul goes to Jerusalem to meet with the Jerusalem leaders. And we know from Galatians chapter 2 that the leaders of the Jerusalem church included, at minimum, Peter, James, and John. And so these are the individuals that Paul meets with Luke present. Furthermore, notice that in chapter 24, we learn that Paul and Luke end up in Caesarea Maritima for at least 2 years. Paul's actually imprisoned there, and you can see on the map here on the screen that Caesarea Maritima is actually relatively close to Jerusalem. This is Caesarea Maritima. This is Jerusalem. It's about 45-mile distance between them. And so during that 2-year period, Luke would have had ample opportunity to converse with Jerusalem witnesses and to interview them. And so Luke was in a unique position to know what the alleged witnesses of the resurrection were claiming. Not only is Luke present with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts 21 when he meets with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, who were key witnesses to Jesus' life, ministry, and ultimately his resurrection from the dead. And Luke is also in Caesarea Maritima for at least 2 years, which is close to Jerusalem, and so would have had a lot of opportunity, if he so wished, to do the research, to go into Jerusalem and to converse with those witnesses or purported witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. And so Luke is in a very unique position to know what the alleged witnesses were claiming concerning the nature of the resurrection encounters. And as I'll show, given Luke's demonstrated meticulousness as an historian, together with the fact that he's putting his own neck on the line, he's traveling around with Paul during Paul's, so it seems to me to be very probable that he's giving us an accurate representation of what the alleged witnesses said. Now, let's turn to the second contention, that the author reliably worked with Paul, and so he's at the Jerusalem church. So he's actually telling us the truth here when he claims to have been present with Paul during Paul's travels, and in particular, when Paul was in Jerusalem and in Caesarea. So let me give you 3 lines of argument to establish this. And this is just a sample. There's a lot more that could be said here, but time is limited, so I'm giving you a limited sample. First, Luke had poly knowledge of Paul's activities. That is, knowledge of Paul's activities that's best explained by Luke being a traveling companion of Paul. Second, Luke has poly knowledge of the world. That is to say, knowledge of the world that is best explained by Luke being a traveling companion of Paul. And third, Luke traveled with Paul to Rome, and so he must have been at the Jerusalem church and in Caesarea, from which Paul departed en route to Rome. Let's start with the first of these contentions, that Luke has poly knowledge of Paul's activities. And the argument that I would adduce for this is an argument that was pioneered and developed by William Paley, the philosopher I mentioned previously, who wrote a masterful book, in my opinion, one of the best treatments of the reliability of Acts ever composed, called Hora Paulinae, which develops an argument called undesigned coincidences, and this relates to relationships between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. And this is best explained by giving examples. So let me dive into some examples here. So the book of First Corinthians was written from Ephesus in Asia Minor, and is written to a Greek city called Corinth, the capital of Achaia. And in chapter 4 and verse 17, Paul says, "That's why I sent you Timothy, my faithful and beloved child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." Now notice the aorist, or the past tense here. That is why I sent you Timothy. And at the time of his writing from Ephesus to Corinth, he's apparently already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. So Timothy's already been sent. But in chapter 16 verse 10, it says, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord, as I am." So even though Paul has already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth, he apparently expects his letter to get there first, right? So Paul expects his letter to arrive before Timothy gets there. And so what would we infer from those very subtle clues in 1 Corinthians? Well, we'd infer that Timothy must have taken a route to Corinth that's less direct than that taken by the letter. Well, here's a map. And you can see this is the Mediterranean Sea here. This is the Aegean Sea. This is Ephesus in Asia Minor, now what we now call Turkey. And this is Corinth, the capital of Achaia. And we'd infer that the letter presumably went the oversea route over the Aegean Sea from Ephesus to Corinth. It's the more direct way by boat. And then Timothy presumably took the indirect overland route going up to Troas and Macedonia on his way around to Corinth, which would explain why Paul has already sent Timothy at the time of his writing, but nonetheless expects his letter to get there first. Well, let's turn over to chapter 19. It says, "After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must also see Rome.' And having sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So Paul does in fact remain behind in Ephesus, in Asia, and he sends Timothy, along with Erastus, up through Macedonia, precisely the route you would expect, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But notice that Acts doesn't even mention Corinth as Timothy's destination. It's a very, very indirect connection. In fact, what's interesting is that in chapter 20, we read that following the riot in Ephesus, it says, "After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater of the Bereans and Apphia accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy." And so Timothy apparently did in fact make it to Corinth. And so that it fits with what you expect from those very subtle clues in 1 Corinthians, but it's a very, very indirect connection. And so it actually supports not only the Pauline authorship of 1 Corinthians, which is not contested anyway, but it also supports the historicity of the book of Acts. Now, going back to chapter 19, who's Timothy's traveling companion up through Macedonia? It's a guy called Erastus. Now, who's Erastus? Now, the book of Romans, as it turns out, was actually written during that 3-month stint of which you read in chapter 20 that Paul spends in Corinth, in Greece. What's interesting is that if we go over to chapter 16 of Romans, verse 23, it says, "Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you." Erastus apparently is the city treasurer of Corinth. In fact, he's also alluded to in 2 Timothy 4:20. Erastus remained at Corinth. There's even an archaeological discovery, a pavement slab that was recovered from the ruins of ancient Corinth that bears the inscription, "Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense," and that's in Latin. And so how fitting then that Timothy, on his way up through Macedonia with the intention of going around to Corinth, should be traveling with a guy whom we know independently happened to be a resident in the city of Corinth. And so it fits precisely the way you would expect on the hypothesis of straightforward historical reportage. And there are scores and scores and scores of these undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters. If you were to limit the data set only to Romans, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 letters we have in the New Testament. I could already give you more than 40 examples of this sort of undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letters. Let me give you a handful of other ones. So Acts 15, 37 through 41. This has to do with Paul's second missionary journey. And it says, "Now Barnabas wanted to take with him John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement. So they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed." Now, there's this falling out between Paul and Barnabas over Mark, because Mark has previously withdrawn from them on a mission trip through Pamphylia. This disagreement is so sharp that Paul and Barnabas actually part company and go their own separate ways. Now, there appears to be some sort of backstory between, or connection of some kind between Mark and Barnabas, but Acts does not explain what that backstory or connection is. However, when we go over to Colossians, one of Paul's epistles, prison epistles written from Rome, we read in chapter 4 and verse 10, "Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." Mark and Barnabas are cousins. This illuminates or clarifies this apparent connection or backstory that Barnabas and Mark have that's not explained by Acts. But and Acts never mentions this familiar relationship that exists between Mark and Barnabas. But the Colossians makes no mention of this rift between Paul and Barnabas over Mark. It seems that by the time of Paul's first Roman imprisonment, when he composed Colossians, this rift had been resolved. But nonetheless, the accounts dovetail or fit together in a manner that actually supports not only the Pauline authorship of Colossians, but also the historicity of the book of Acts. Here's another example. In Acts 17, 13 through 15, it says, so just some backstory here. So Paul was in Thessalonica. There were some Jews that stirred up trouble for him there in Thessalonica, and so he actually had to leave to go to Berea. And it says in verse 13 and following, "When the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed." Now notice that Timothy and Silas are left behind in Berea while Paul goes to Athens. This separation between Paul and Timothy is unexplained in Acts. It's an unexplained allusion. It's also interesting to note that Timothy and Silas are given this instruction to come to him as soon as possible, but they don't actually arrive from Macedonia until Paul is in Corinth in Acts chapter 18, verse 5. And so one wonders, what have they been doing this whole time? We're not told in Acts. But let's go over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We read, "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved with these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter attempted you, and our labor would be in vain." And so, just to give you a little bit of a perspective on the geography here, so you can see on the map, this is Thessalonica up here, and this is Berea. They're actually about 45 miles apart. Berea and Thessalonica are both in Macedonia, and they're relatively close geographically, as you can see. Paul has to leave Berea in haste to go to Athens, which is down here, quite a ways away. And he apparently, under the circumstances, was concerned for the well-being of the Christians in Thessalonica. So he left Berea for Athens in haste because Jews from Thessalonica came to Berea to stir up people against him. And under the circumstances, Paul was apparently concerned about the Christians in Thessalonica. So he commissioned Timothy to go back to Thessalonica to check on the church there. Luke, in the book of Acts, has just omitted the sending of Timothy from Berea to Thessalonica, thus leaving the cause of his separation from Paul unexplained. Let's go to another example from 1 Thessalonians. This is from chapter 2 and verse 2. "But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. This raises an interesting question. How come the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi? Well, what shameful treatment does he have in mind? Well, let's go over to Acts 16, 35 through 39. Remember, Paul and Silas are in the Philippian jail, and there's an earthquake, and they're freed, and the Philippian jailer gets converted, and so on. And it tells us that when it was day, the magistrate sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. And so this is the shameful treatment in Philippi that Paul's talking about, that he had been beaten publicly, uncondemned, and had thrown them into prison. And this was against Roman law. And so Paul is indignant about this shameful treatment that he received in Philippi. Now, where does Paul go next? In chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews." His very next port of call is Thessalonica. In fact, the route that Paul took from Philippi to Thessalonica was a major Roman highway, the Via Egnatia, and the cities named by Luke were actually overnight stops on that route. According to Acts, Paul came to Thessalonica on the same missionary journey shortly after his mistreatment in Philippi. Paul has been outraged that he had been flogged in spite of being a Roman citizen and imprisoned without trial by authorities at Philippi. From the phrase "had been shamefully treated at Philippi," as you know, and from the text in Acts, one can envision Paul recounting the story still full of indignation to the new converts in Thessalonica, which explains his words in 1 Thessalonians 2, "shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know," because he came there as his very next port of call. Now, the argument from undesigned coincidences is actually bolstered by evidence of literary independence between Acts and Paul's letters. The majority of scholars actually think, I think with good reason, that the author of Acts is not utilizing Paul's writings as a source in composing his own Acts narrative. And you can actually make this case for most of Paul's epistles that they're independent of Acts. For example, so here's an argument that 1 Thessalonians and Acts are independent. From Acts, it would be naturally inferred that Paul's converts at Thessalonica were all Jews, or at least Gentile God-fearers. Whereas, contrast this with 1 Thessalonians 1:9. "You turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God." If Acts were utilizing 1 Thessalonians as a source, you would expect there to be more of an emphasis on the conversion of pagans rather than Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. Whereas if 1 Thessalonians were using Acts as a source, you would expect there to be more emphasis on the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Greeks. These aren't, of course, irreconcilable. It's just a difference in emphasis, but nonetheless, it does support literary independence. Here's another example. So in Acts 18, 3 through 5, it says, "And because," this is when Paul has just got acquainted with Aquila and Priscilla, who were in Rome, but unfortunately for them, Claudius the emperor expelled all the Jews from Rome. Suetonius also tells us about this, and they ended up in Corinth, and Paul meets them in Corinth. And it says that because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ." You'll notice that Paul actually changes his ministry model. He starts out working as a tent maker during the weekdays and doing his ministry work, his evangelism in the synagogues on the Sabbath day. Whereas in response to Silas and Timothy arriving from Macedonia, he changed his ministry model, beginning to devote himself completely to the word. And so he's now entirely devoted to his ministry. What happened that initiated this change? We're not told in Acts. What caused the shift from Paul's working all week and doing evangelism on the Sabbath to his devoting himself completely to the word? Well, it apparently had something to do with the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia. Let's turn over to 2 Corinthians 11. We read in verses 8 and 9, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. And so apparently, Silas and Timothy brought financial supplies from Macedonia when they arrived from Macedonia to Greece. In fact, there's also evidence in Philippians 4 of this, where Paul says in verses 15 and 16, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. And Philippi, of course, is in Macedonia. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, potentially with others, and they'd bring financial supplies. And so this explains or illuminates why Paul changes his ministry model and why he's able to devote himself entirely to the ministry in response to Silas and Timothy arriving from Macedonia. Now, we can also make a case that Acts and 2 Corinthians are independent. Titus, for example, is a very prominent figure throughout 2 Corinthians. He's mentioned several different times, but he's mentioned nowhere in the book of Acts. If the book of Acts were using 2 Corinthians as a source, it is curious that there's no mention at all of Titus throughout the book of Acts. Furthermore, Paul's trials are listed in 2 Corinthians 11 cannot be readily correlated with Acts. You expect there to be more of an easy correlation between Paul's laundry list of his sufferings and trials in 2 Corinthians 11 and the book of Acts if there was a literary relationship. Third, Acts 9:23 emphasizes the role of the Jews in the plot to assassinate Paul in Damascus, whereas in 2 Corinthians 11:32, which recounts the same event, mentions the involvement of Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans, but not of the Jews. No doubt there was some sort of conspiracy involving both Aretas and the Jews in Damascus, but neither tells us about that conspiracy. It's only when you put the two accounts together, but it does point to independence. Acts makes no mention of the collection for the relief of the saints in Jerusalem. That's a major theme in Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians, but there's no explicit reference to it in the book of Acts, except a very subtle and cryptic reference when Paul's speaking to Felix in Acts 24. Okay, so that's just a sample. Obviously, I could keep going for hours talking about undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters. I'm just giving you a very small sample to illustrate this form of argumentation. Now, let's take another line of argumentation, and that is external corroborations of Acts. So Luke has knowledge of the world that is best explained by Luke being a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. So first, let's consider what Luke tells us about overland routes, cities, landmarks, and political boundaries. He gets right the proper location of Iconium in Phrygia rather than in Laconia. This is in the middle of Asia Minor, not on the coast. Right, it's something you have to hike over land over, rather rough terrain to get to in modern day Turkey. And that location was changed not too long after the time of the New Testament. But we've now uncovered evidence that, in fact, at that time, it was located in Phrygia rather than in Laconia. The correct order of approach, Derbe and then Lystra from the Cilician gates. We can go and verify that since we know where those cities are. We can watch how that would unfold if you were traveling overland. Now, how do you get that in a local library, right? You have to bear in mind that this is in an age before ease of access to information. You can't just go on Google and Wikipedia and look things up. You can't just nip down to the local library and consult a contemporary reference work. It's much more difficult to access this sort of specialized local information in this time period. You've got the proper description of Philippi as a Roman colony and the identification of its seaport as Neapolis, which is attested both in manuscripts and in numismatic evidence, that is to do with coins. This was actually a special status for a city to be called a Roman colony, giving the city special privileges. Philippi was particularly proud of it. This is actually why Paul in Philippians says, our citizenship is in heaven, right? The Philippians were very proud of their status as a Roman colony. And this status is actually attested from coins and Latin inscriptions. Acts 16:13 mentions they're going to a riverside outside the gate. This is the River Gangites, but it wasn't a huge famous river, not like the Nile. And the author doesn't even mention the name, so you have apparent casualness. The proper locations, Amphipolis and Apollonia, which I mentioned already, cities about 30 miles apart, where travelers would spend successive nights on this journey to Thessalonica. And this is a major Roman highway, as I mentioned before, the Via Egnatia. A natural crossing, so in terms of sea routes and landmarks, so a natural crossing between correctly named ports. Mount Cassius, which is south of Seleucia, is within sight of Cyprus. The proper port Perga for a ship crossing from Cyprus. The proper port Italia that returning travelers would use. This was a coasting port where they would go to intercept a coasting vessel, by contrast with Perga, which was a river port. The place of a conspicuous sailor's landmarks, the Matherkay, dominated by a 5,000-foot mountain. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens from Berea, with the favoring Etesian winds of the summer sailing season. In Acts 20, verses 13 through 14, we read, "But going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene." So on his last journey in Acts to Jerusalem, Paul decides to walk from Troas to Assos on the tip of Asia Minor, having the ship on which his friends are sailing pick him up at Assos. Now, you might be tempted to ask here, how would this work? Wouldn't the ship sail a bit faster than Paul could walk, right? Well, let's take a look at a map. As you can see from the map, the ship actually has to go around the Cape Lectum, so there would actually be time for Paul to walk and meet the ship. In fact, Colin Hemer, in his book, The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History, which is one of the best treatments, in my opinion, of external corroborations of Acts, Hemer explains, Paul staying behind at Troas and traveling overland to rejoin the ship's company at Assos is appropriate to local circumstances, where the ship had to negotiate an exposed coast and double Cape Lectum before reaching Assos. In the middle of the so-called we passages, the author is giving a blow-by-blow account of this last trip to Jerusalem. This is in Acts 21, verse 1. And he says that they found a ship at Patara in Asia Minor, which is over here, and that was sailing across to Phoenicia, just north of the Holy Land. So down this route here to Phoenicia, which is just north of Jerusalem. Patara, it turns out, was in fact a port used in the corn trade and would have been a likely place to find a ship headed that way. Even more striking, the name is neuter plural, possibly meaning baskets, and Acts gives the exact right form of the town's name, which is attested from inscriptions. And again, this is not the kind of thing that would just be in the stock of common knowledge. Here's another example. So in Acts 22, verses 25 through 28, we read about Paul before the Roman tribune. It says, "When they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, 'Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?' When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, 'What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen.' So the tribune came and said to him, 'Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?' And he said, 'Yes.' The tribune answered, 'I bought the citizenship for a large sum.' Paul said, 'But I am a citizen by birth.'" Now, pay attention to verse 28. The tribune responds to Paul, telling him that he is in fact a Roman citizen, by saying, "I bought the citizenship for a large sum." Why do you think the tribune says this? Well, let's go over to a 2nd century Roman historian, Cassius Dio, and he tells us that actually during the reign of Claudius, it was introduced that you could purchase a Roman citizenship, and it started out very expensive, and he saturated the upper markets. But then Cassius Dio explains that for this reason, though the privilege was at first sold only for large sums, it later became so cheapened by the facility with which it could be obtained that it came to be a common saying that a man could become a citizen by giving the right person some bits of broken glass. And so this adds some color to the tribune's words. "I paid a large sum for my citizenship." In other words, how much did you pay, Paul? And Paul, of course, informs him that he is a citizen by birth. And so it provides some historical backstory to what's going on in Acts. But the account in Acts is very casual and never explains the situation here. Okay, so that's just a sample. In terms of external corroborations of Acts, I could deduce more than 100 examples. It's an avalanche of positive pieces of confirmatory evidence there. But let's go to a third line of argument that Luke was indeed a traveling companion of Paul, just as he claims, and that is that Luke traveled with Paul to Rome. Acts 27 and Acts 28 are the most chock-full chapters in the book of Acts in terms of external points of historical corroboration. Let me just give you a sample. There's actually a whole book written on this by James Smith called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. So if you want a really deep dive treatment of this topic, I recommend James Smith's book. In Acts 27, it says, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners. We put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So again, this is among the wee passages the author is claiming to be with Paul during this time, which would imply, of course, that he was in fact with Paul in Caesarea Maritima and by extension in Jerusalem before that. In verses 3 through 5, it continues, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. So this is Caesarea Maritima, where remember Paul and Luke are for 2 years, where Paul's imprisoned. And then they go from Caesarea to Sidon, and from Sidon to Myra, which is up here, past the island of Cyprus. And from here, they actually transferred to a Greek Alexandrian grain ship. So it tells us that there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. And it later turns out it's an Alexandrian grain ship. Now, Colin Hemer, in his book, The Book of Acts and the Sending of Hellenistic History, explains that Myra, like Patara again, was a principal port for the Alexandrian corn ships, and precisely the place where Julius would expect to find a ship sailing to Italy in the imperial service. Its official standing here is further illustrated by the Hadrianic granary. Myra was also the first of these ports to be reached by a ship arriving from the east, as Patara had been previously from the reverse direction. So just to give some background, Luke tells us earlier in Acts 11:28 that there was a famine during the reign of Claudius, and we've verified this because Josephus talks about the same famine, and it was over the world of Judea. And we know that Claudius established this grain fleet that would truck up to 150,000 tons of corn from a Greek city known as Alexandria in Egypt. So anyways, the Roman centurion transfers these prisoners onto one of these Alexandrian grain ships, and they end up at Crete. So this is Myra, where we left off last time, and they end up at Crete. And so from here at Crete, they're trying to circumnavigate the island from along the coastline, and they're sailing along the coast there of Crete. But in verse 13 and 14, it says, along Crete, they sailed along Crete close to the shore, but soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. Now, what's interesting, the wind that rides over Crete from the northeast, and meteorological evidence actually reveals that a sudden change from a mild southerly wind to a violent northeasterly wind often occurs in late fall in the Eastern Mediterranean. And actually, if you look at verse 9 of Acts 27, we learn that this event is taking place during the fast or around the Day of Atonement, which would be, in fact, in the late fall, right? So the time actually fits with what we know from the meteorological data. Now, in verse 16, it says, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. So they actually get blown off course towards this island of Cauda. Now, what's impressive is that Cauda, the island, is more than 20 miles west-southwest of where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Massara. In fact, it's precisely where the trajectory of a northeaster should have carried them. And it's not the sort of information that someone would have inferred without having been blown there. In fact, the ancients found it nearly impossible to properly locate islands that far off coast. In fact, Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke's day, and both actually contradict Luke. But Luke's account alone is the only account that actually gets the implied location of the Isle of Cauda correct. In fact, Colin Hemer notes, that it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that such details could have been derived from any kind of contemporary reference work. He goes on to say that in the places where we can compare, Luke fares much better than the Encyclopedist Pliny, who might be regarded as the foremost first-century example of such a source. Pliny places Cauda opposite Hieripna, some 90 miles too far east. Even Ptolemy, who was a geographer, who offers a reckoning of latitude and longitude, makes a serious dislocation to the northwest, putting Cauda too near the western end of Crete, in a position which would not suit the unstudied narrative of our text. So it's another striking point of historical corroboration. Here's another one. In Acts 28, verse 7, it says, this is when they were on Malta. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius. In Greek, it says, to prototes nesu onomati Publio. In other words, the first man of the island, named Publio, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Ancient inscriptions actually reveal that the head official on Malta had the title first man of the island. So this is, again, just a peak of the iceberg. I'm just giving you a glimpse of the extent to which we can corroborate the accounts in Acts. As I said, there's a whole book just on the shipwreck, which is on Acts 27-28 by James Smith, called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. So I highly recommend that for your reading. Take-home point is that the author of Luke's Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. Not only does Luke claim to have received information from eyewitnesses, but we can demonstrate that he had direct access to purported eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. He was with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts 21, when Paul meets with the Jerusalem leaders, which included, according to Galatians 2, at minimum Peter, James, and John. And Luke is also with Paul in prison in Caesarea Maritima in relative geographical proximity to the Jerusalem witnesses to Jesus' life, and in particular, purported witnesses of the resurrection. So Luke is in a unique position to know what the witnesses themselves were saying concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus. And given Luke's demonstrated meticulousness as an historian, of which we've only scraped the surface of the evidence for, together with the fact he's putting his own neck on the line, traveling around with Paul during Paul's imprisonments and persecutions and so on, it seems very, very likely that he's giving us an accurate representation of his understanding of what the apostles themselves said. And he's also, of course, claims in his prologue that he received information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word concerning Jesus' life and so forth. And so there's absolutely no reason to doubt him and every reason to believe that he's telling us the truth. Okay, so having established that what Luke Acts tells us concerning the nature of the resurrection encounters actually reflects what the witnesses themselves said, then we can move on to our second contention, that the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived. So let me give you some, so studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is often unreliable when particular conditions are met. So under the following conditions, among others, eyewitness testimony is typically unreliable, especially on the details, if the events happen quickly, over a period of seconds or minutes, if the participants are strangers to one another, or if there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun. Contrast this with the nature of the claimed resurrection encounters. They are public. Jesus appears to multiple people at once. In Luke 24, he appears to Cleopas and his companion. In Acts 1, we're told that he appears to the disciples over a 40-day time period, showing many convincing proofs that he's alive and so forth. In Luke 24, he also appears to the disciples as a group. So it appears to multiple people at once. They are multisensory in character, so they involve not just sight, but hearing, dialogue, group conversations, physical contact, etc. It's the sort of set of claims about which is really quite difficult to be sincerely mistaken. And moreover, they are extended across a 40-day time period. So it's not just one brief, confusing episode. Think back to a time when you were in high school, perhaps hanging out with someone over summer break that you used to hang out with. Do you think you could testify under oath this was in fact your friend and not someone else? And then number two, they were alive and not dead. Well, absolutely, because it's the sort of thing about which is really, really difficult to be sincerely mistaken about, this sort of level of detail and particulars and specificity concerning the nature of those claimed experiences. And so hopefully we can agree that the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived, that they were honestly mistaken. Let's then turn to my third contention, that the circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceivers. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Why would they die or be willing to suffer persecutions and hardships and dangers and so forth on account of something that they knew to be false? People will suffer and die for things that they believe to be true, but not so much for things that people believe to be false. William Paley, in his book A View of the Evidence of Christianity, which is one of the best treatments of the case for the resurrection, highly recommend everyone read A View of the Evidence of Christianity. If you want a PDF of it, send me an email and I will furnish you with a free copy of A View of the Evidence of Christianity. It's copyright free. So he writes concerning the voluntary sufferings of the apostles that there was satisfactory evidence that many, professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings voluntarily undergone in attestation of the accounts which they delivered, and solely in consequence of their belief in those accounts, and that they also submitted from the same motives to new rules of conduct. Now, what is some of the evidence that the early apostles did, in fact, endure hardships and dangers and sufferings and persecutions and imprisonments on account of the resurrection and their profession of the messiahship of Christ? Well, there's both indirect evidence and direct evidence. Indirect evidence pertaining to the general context of persecution, and direct evidence pertaining to the apostles specifically being willing to suffer persecution and hardship and dangers and martyrdom. In fact, William Paley spends a whole 8 chapters in his book laying out this evidence. So I'm just giving you a snapshot here. Let's start with the indirect evidence. That is the evidence of the general persecution. So Cornelius Tacitus, who was a member of the Roman Senate and a Roman historian, he tells us, this is from his Annals of Imperial Rome, that during the reign of Nero in 64 AD, there was a fire that broke out in Rome, and that the people blamed the fire on an order from Nero himself. And Nero needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to blame for the fire. And so we pick up the story here in Tacitus. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, where he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. Notice, by the way, his phrase that a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. So even before this, the Christians were hated by the populace. They were called Christians by the populace. Christians was actually kind of a derisory term in the early days. And they were hated for their abominations. So they were already very, very unpopular bunch, even prior to this state persecution by the Romans ensuing from the fire in 64 under the orders of Nero. Suetonius also, in his Life of Nero, Suetonius was a Roman biographer of the 12 Caesars, he says that Nero likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, the sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. William Paley, in his A View of the Evidence of Christianity, comments, these things, as has already been observed, took place within 31 years after Jesus' death. That is, according to the course of nature, in the lifetime, probably, of some of the apostles, and certainly in the lifetime of those who were converted by the apostles or who converted in their lifetime. If then the founder of the religion was put to death in the execution of his design, if the first race of converts to the religion, many of them suffered the greatest extremities for their profession, it is hardly credible that those who came between the two who were the companions of the author of the institution during his life, and the teachers and propagators of the institution after his death, could go about their undertaking with ease and safety. And bear in mind, as I said before, the whole reason why Nero blamed the Christians and used them as a scapegoat is because they were already hated for their abominations by the populace. They were already unpopular. And so what Paley says here makes a lot of sense. We also have evidence even before the persecution, the state-sanctioned persecution under Nero, that the Christians endured hardships and dangers and labors and persecutions and imprisonments and so on account of their testimony of Christ's resurrection. If we read the Pauline letters, we read various letters that are distributed to churches all around the Mediterranean. And a very consistent theme is that Christians are to bear up in the midst of persecution. So, for example, in the book of Philippians, which was written during Paul's first Roman imprisonment, written between around 60 to 62 AD, Paul says, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and I hear that I still have." 2 Corinthians 4, 8 through 12. "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you." This was written around 55 or 56 AD. 2 Thessalonians 1:4, written around 51 or 52 AD. Paul says, "Therefore, we ourselves boast about you in the churches of God for your steadfastness and faith in all your persecutions and in the afflictions that you are enduring." In Romans 5, "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." In Romans 8, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." So Paul was writing that around 57 to 59 AD. The book of Hebrews, chapter 10, probably written 370 AD, although it's hard to be more specific than that. But whoever wrote Hebrews, who probably was a close associate of the Apostle Paul, though not Paul himself, says, "But recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." Turn over to chapter 11 of Hebrews, where after giving us the hall of fame of the saints who had faith in the Old Testament, he says, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies, they're dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So this is written as a source of encouragement to the Hebrews that he's writing to. The book of James, chapter 5, says, "As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Again, written to encourage saints in enduring persecution. 1 Peter 4, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fire trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you." So we can see these letters that were distributed to churches all around the Mediterranean, constantly and consistently encouraging their audiences to bear up in the midst of hostile persecution. And so this suggests that there was, in fact, a pretty widespread context of hostility and persecution towards the early Christian movement. We can also go to the Gospels. In Matthew 24:9, Jesus says to the disciples, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. In Mark 13, but be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit, and so on. And so William Paley remarks that I'm not entitled to argue from these passages that Christ actually did foretell these events, and that they did accordingly come to pass, because that would be at once to assume the truth of the religion. But I am entitled to contend that one side or other of the following disjunction is true: either that the evangelists have delivered what Christ really spoke, and that the events correspond with the prediction, or that they put the prediction into Christ's mouth, because at the time of writing the history, the event had turned out so to be. For the only two remaining suppositions appear to in the highest degree incredible, which are either that Christ filled the minds of his followers with fears and apprehensions without any reason or authority for what he said, and contrary to the truth of the case, or that although Christ had never foretold any such thing, and the events would have contradicted him if he had, yet historians who lived in the age when the event was known, falsely as well as officiously ascribed these words to him. So, in other words, it seems very unlikely, if there were no such conduct of persecution with which to speak of, that the apostles would have, that the evangelists would have ascribed these words to Jesus. There's also, so that's the indirect evidence, that is for the general conduct of persecution. There is also direct evidence that bears on the apostles specifically. So, for example, in John 21:18, we read, Jesus said to Peter, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you were old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." And John adds that Jesus said this to indicate to Peter the type of death by which he was to glorify God. So, it seems John was probably written between 1995 AD, and it seems very unlikely that if Peter hadn't died in the manner that Jesus prescribed, that John would have attributed this saying to Jesus, because then it would have been a false prophecy. We can also go to external sources to the Bible. So this is Clement of Rome, who was the bishop of the church in Rome in the late 1st century, and he's writing here to the church in Corinth. Most scholars date it to around 96 AD. And he says, "But not to dwell upon ancient examples, let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our own generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two, but numerous labors. And when he at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance. After being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned, after preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus was he removed from the world and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience." And Clement is actually mentioned by Paul in Philippians 4. He was an associate of Paul, a friend of Paul. And Irenaeus tells us he was made bishop of the church in Rome by apostles, Peter and Paul. And so he's in a unique position to know these sorts of things. And yet he says that the early apostles, he mentions Peter and Paul specifically, were persecuted and martyred for their faith. Polycarp of Smyrna, he was an early Christian martyr. According to Irenaeus, he was a disciple of John. So again, someone that's very much in the position to know these sorts of things. Writing in the early 2nd century, probably around 110 AD, to the church in Philippi, he says, "I exhort you all, therefore, to yield obedience to the word of righteousness, and to exercise all patience, such as ye have seen set before your eyes, not only in the case of the blessed Ignatius and Zosimus and Rufus, but also in others among yourselves, and in Paul himself, and the rest of the apostles. This do in the assurance that all these have not run in vain, but in faith and righteousness, and that they are now in their due place in the presence of the Lord, with whom also they suffered, for they love not this present world, but him who died for us, and for our sakes was raised again by God from the dead." We also have the book of Acts. And the book of Acts meticulously lists the names of the 11, even though a list of the 12 is already supplied by the Gospel of Luke. And he then records a scene in which Peter himself is extremely explicit about having no fewer than 12 men who can attest as witnesses to the resurrection, and hence the need to elect a replacement for Judas. Acts names the 2 people, Joseph called Barsabbas and Matthias, who were candidates, and names the person who was chosen by casting lots, turns out to be Matthias. And this indicates that those 12 were acting in leadership capacities in Jerusalem in that very early period. In Acts 2:14, we are explicitly told that the 11 were standing up with Peter and endorsing his message on Pentecost. And immediately following Peter's speech, people start asking what they need to do in light of that speech. And this is said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, which is in the context must include all the other 11. And this indicates that the 12 began by speaking boldly on Pentecost, that they were planning to have an important ongoing leadership role in the early Christian movement, and that this leadership role would be focused on testifying to Jesus' resurrection. Now, by proclaiming the resurrection boldly at Pentecost, the 12 were already risking their lives for their message. And this was a mere 6 weeks following Jesus' own death by crucifixion at the instigation of the Jewish leaders. Peter's speech hardly spares the feelings of those same leaders. Peter's statements in his address are very confrontational and provocative. Acts 2:23, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Verse 36, that all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Here's some additional evidence from succeeding chapters of the continued leadership of the 12 despite the hostile context of persecution. In Acts 2:41 through 47, it indicates that immediately following Peter's speech, the apostles continued a public ministry. Acts 5:12 states that many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles, and they were all together in Solomon's portico. This indicates that Solomon's porch was a common meeting place for the apostles, as was previously indicated by Acts 3:11 and by John 10:23. Acts 5:17 and 18 indicates that the high priest and the Sadducees arrested the apostles and put them in the public prison. They were freed from the prison that same night by an angel and resumed preaching the gospel. And the high priest states, we strictly charge you not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Peter replies, we must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him in a tree. God exalted him at his right hand as leader and savior to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. We are witnesses to these things. And so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him. Verse 40 indicates that when they had called in the apostles, they beat them and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. In spite of this, we read in verse 42 that every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. In other words, not only did they rejoice that they could suffer for Jesus, but they defied the order to stop preaching and teaching publicly. Acts 6:2 indicates that in the context of appointing deacons to administer to widows, that the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples, that is, all 12 of them, including Matthias, that was elected to replace Judas, and said, it's not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. The 12 then appoint certain individuals to deal with this issue, since the 12 need to focus on prayer and religious teaching. Indeed, the 12 are so committed to their dangerous leadership role, the ministry of the word, that they want others to be chosen for other jobs. Acts 7:54 through 60 recounts the stoning of Stephen, one of the appointed deacons. He wasn't himself an apostle, he was one of the deacons, and he wasn't necessarily a witness to the resurrection, but nonetheless, the stoning of Stephen publicly should have served as a warning shot to those apostles about the dangerous nature of the project they were undertaking about preaching the name of Christ as Messiah and as resurrected Lord. Acts 8:1 states that there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles who remained in Jerusalem. The text makes an explicit distinction between the apostles who remained in Jerusalem under the persecution launched by Saul of Tarsus and the other believers. In Acts 12, it tells us about that time Herod the king, that is Herod Agrippa I, who was the son of Herod Antipas and the grandson of Herod the Great, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. By the way, notice this expression, when he saw that it pleased the Jews. Now, if you look up Josephus, he has a section where he compares Herod Agrippa I with the Herod that came before him, which I think is probably speaking of Herod the Great, his grandfather. And it's actually contrasting their personalities. And it says, now this king, speaking about Herod Agrippa I, was by nature very beneficent, And liberal in his gifts and very ambitious to oblige people with such large donations, and he made himself very illustrious by the many chargeable presents he made them. He took delight in giving and rejoiced in living with good reputation. He was not at all like that Herod who reigned before him, for that Herod was ill-natured and severe in his punishments, and had no mercy on them that he hated. And everyone perceived that he was more friendly to the Greeks than to the Jews, for he adorned foreign cities with large presents and money, with building them baths and theatres besides. Nay, in some of those places he erected temples and porticos and others, but he did not vouchsafe to raise one of the least edifices in any Jewish city, or make them any donation that was worth mentioning. But Agrippa's temper was mild, and equally liberal to all men. He was humane to foreigners, and made them sensible of his liberality. He was in like manner rather of a gentle and compassionate temper. Accordingly, he loved to live continually at Jerusalem, and was exactly careful in the observance of the laws of his country. He therefore kept himself entirely pure, nor did any day pass over his head without his appointed sacrifice. So notice that according to Josephus, Herod Agrippa I, one defining characteristic of his reign was that he took great pains to please the Jews. He really wanted to keep the Jews happy and appeased, which dovetails very well with what we see in Acts 12, that Herod Agrippa I, when he sought to please the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. So it's a little bit of historical background there. There's also an account in Josephus concerning the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, where he writes, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was upon the road, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and was brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. And of course, this is especially significant because James, according to John 7:5, Jesus' own brothers were not believers in him during his lifetime. Mark 3 indicates when his family come to speak to him, they say he's out of his mind. And in John 19, when Jesus is on the cross, he entrusts the care of his mother, not to his own brother, but to the beloved disciple, which suggests that Jesus' brothers were not believers even then. And so it's striking then that James, according to 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus appeared to James, and according to Josephus, and a later 2nd century Christian historian called Hecachippus, James died as a martyr for his belief that Jesus was the Messiah. And so how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the God of Israel and the Messiah of the Hebrew Scriptures to the point of martyrdom? It seems that it would take something pretty radical. So that's significant. So to summarize then, the evidence presented in the foregoing indicates that the early apostles, in particular the 12, continued to hold leadership roles within the church, and that the role of an apostle was as a witness to Christ's resurrection from the dead. Given Peter's behavior on Thursday evening, his threefold denial, why would he suddenly change his mind by Saturday night and decide to start an elaborate hoax, which would involve lifelong continued association with Jesus' name based on a deliberate conspiracy? Of course, the same could be said of the other disciples who all forsook Jesus and fled in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's also the testimony of women, right? In all four Gospels, the first people at the empty tomb are women. And in the patriarchal society that was ancient Israel, the testimony of a woman was considered a fraction of that of a male witness. Josephus, for example, says, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." A quote from the Jewish Talmud says, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." N.T. Wright, a British historian, says, "As historians, we are obliged to comment if these stories had been made up 5 years later, or let alone 30, 40, or 50 years later, they would never have put Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead, like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up. But you can go further than this. Why involve the women at all? Right, in the first place, this is quite aside from the criterion of embarrassment argument. This is a matter of getting these 5, at least women, unnecessarily involved and inducing them to say that they were the first to see Jesus risen, and they saw angels, and then counting on them to keep up their side of the story. Right? Why involve them? In that social context, it's not as though their stories were especially likely to carry conviction, and nor were the stories necessary for such a conspiracy. And involving them only added to the risk of discovery, both due to additional numbers of conspirators and due to other social influences on the women. So, for example, what if a husband, father, brother, or other male relative told one of the women witnesses to stop all this silly nonsense? right? Such a relative would have had much more legal and social authority over her than, say, Peter would have had, and might have easily have questioned her and gotten the truth out of her. And moreover, Peter and the other disciples would have had to get the woman involved in the plot in a short time as well, since the woman would be telling their story, at least to other followers of Jesus, long before the day of Pentecost. So is it at all plausible that they slipped off to wherever the various women were staying on the Sabbath while everyone was still in shock from the crucifixion and talked them into participating in such a hoax within a period of less than 48 hours? It seems quite implausible. So why do such a thing? The women were also subject to different influences. Joanna was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, according to Luke 8:3, but Chuza had no influence upon Mary Magdalene, who would be different to other influences, and so forth. Here's a text concerning the women, the Galilean women that followed Jesus out of Galilee. It tells us that afterward, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. And we can infer from the previous chapter, chapter 7, that Jesus and his disciples are in Galilee. Capernaum is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And this is also supported that the women are from Galilee because Joanna was the wife of Herod's household manager, and Herod, of course, was the tetrarch of Galilee. Now, notice that the names actually, so in Mark 15, we have an account of those women that look on look from a distance at the cross. It says there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. And these names overlap only partially with Luke 8, right? So in Mark and Matthew, the names are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, and there's no mention here of Joanna or Susanna. Luke 8 doesn't mention Mary the mother of James or Salome. And it doesn't look at all like Luke added the passage in chapter 8 in order to put the women in place earlier in Jesus' ministry and thus fit his narrative together with Matthew and Mark concerning the women at the cross, because the names are only partially the same. Luke would have presumably included Mary, the mother of James and Salome, and probably left out Susanna if he had fictionalized the verses in chapter 8 on the basis of Mark's mention of the women at the cross. Luke himself mentions the women who came from Galilee at the cross and burial, but he doesn't even name any of them there. Both accounts, therefore, apparently confirm independently that there was a group of women who had began following Jesus in Galilee and who continued to do so, and who helped Jesus in concrete ways by ministering or providing. But wait, there's more. So in Luke 24, verses 6 through 10, we read about the angel appearing to the women, and we're told that the angel says he is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. And they, that is the women who came out from Galilee, remembered his words and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So this makes it clear that these women really were personally with Jesus in Galilee, and they heard what he said there. But when Luke names various women who brought the disciples news of the empty tomb and the message of the angel in 24:10, he names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Joanna, and he says that there were other women as well. So once again, he doesn't seem to be trying to reproduce his own list from chapter 8, because Mary, the mother of James, was not in that list, and Susanna isn't mentioned in 24:10. Nor is he reproducing Mark's list of women at the cross, because nor Mark's list of women who came to the tomb in Mark 16:1, because Salome isn't included in Luke's list, and Joanna, who's unique to Luke, is not included in Mark's list. In fact, this is a table that actually shows the distribution of the mentions of the various women across the 3 synoptic gospels, or across Mark and Luke, rather. Luke 24:10, Mark 15:40, and Luke 8:1 through 3. Luke seems to be listing women whom he really knows were present for the events on Easter morning. Evidently, he isn't sure about Susanna's presence, or just doesn't bother to mention her. And he knows that Mary, the mother of James, was there on Easter morning, even though she isn't listed in his chapter 8. So this is an example of an undesigned coincidence that's internal to Luke, a way in which fairly distant parts of Luke's own narrative actually fit together in an apparently casual and non-deliberate way. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and various other women were with Jesus in Galilee. They heard Jesus' own prediction of his crucifixion and resurrection, and they subsequently went with him to Jerusalem and were present at the cross, burial, and the empty tomb. If the claim of Jesus' resurrection is a conspiracy, then the number of people involved included the 11, the Apostle Paul, at least 5 or 6 women, Cleopas, his companion, James, the brother of Jesus, Matthias and Barsabbas, called Justus, who were both named in Acts 1:23 as fulfilling the requirements of an apostle, i.e. having been witnesses to the resurrection. Being conservative, therefore, and including only those those individuals who are specifically named, there would have needed to have been at least 23 individuals involved in the conspiracy. And it's extremely improbable that all those individuals had something to gain by asserting that Jesus had risen from the dead, and none of them would have recanted. Furthermore, Jesus' own followers seem to have existed in concentric circles, right? You've got the closest three, Peter, James, and John. You've got the 12, the 72, some still larger group. And we appear to have some in all of these groups who said that they actually saw Jesus risen. And at least one, namely James, who was in Jesus' own lifetime outside of all of these groups. And so the alleged witnesses are not all equally knit. They're not all equally tight-knit. They're not all equally under the influence of some charismatic leader. Their interests aren't even all the same. In fact, it's highly likely that such a large heterogeneous group conspiracy would not have held together over time, especially as persecution increased with the beating of Peter and John, and then the stoning of Stephen, the execution of James, the persecution from Saul of Tarsus, etc. So hopefully I've persuaded you that, number one, we possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus was physically from the dead and appeared to them alive, that the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived, that the circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceivers, and therefore the most probable explanation is that the content of their testimony is true. And so I conclude with the words that the angel told the woman at the tomb, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. We've only covered the peak of the proverbial iceberg this evening. I could keep going for many hours, continuing to lay on evidence for the resurrection. If you want some further reading on some of the material that we've been covering this evening, here's a few recommendations to get started with. Paley's work, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, as well as his book Hora Pollinae, masterclass treatment, both of in the first case, the resurrection and other auxiliary arguments for Christianity. In the second case, the reliability of Acts from undesigned coincidences. I recommend Jefferson White's book as a good popular level introduction to the reliability of Acts. It's called Evidence in Paul's Journeys, an historical investigation into the travels of the Apostle Paul. I also recommend Colin Heemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And finally, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts by Lydia McGrew. If you want a more extensive bibliography, recommended resource list, send me an email and I'll send you a longer list of resources along with the PowerPoint slides from this evening's presentation. But I will finish there and happy to entertain any questions. Thanks for your attention.
Right, any questions? I told you it was going to be an overload. Okay. Do you guys have any questions? Yes, sir.
I have a question. So how do we know from the source of like the scriptures that it's been translated into the English Bible as like properly, and the people who did the translation not deceiving us?
Okay, so the question, did you hear the question, Jonathan, or shall I repeat
I
the
heard
question?
parts of it. Could you repeat the question then?
Okay, so the question just is,
Essentially what I'm saying is I do believe that like Luke and Acts is like evidently true 100%.
Yes.
But then how do we know that from the book of Luke and Acts you translate it properly? So the source of the Bible.
yeah, so the question has to do with if we grant that these people were historical, reliable eyewitnesses and so forth, how do we know that these works in Luke and Acts have been translated reliably down to us today?
Okay, so they're translated straight from the original language, which is Greek, and we have pretty good understanding of the original language of Greek, and so there's, I mean, we have pretty good translations. That's not really contested. If by translated, perhaps you also have in mind the textual transmission of the New Testament, and that could be a whole discussion in itself. There's some resources I would recommend on this subject. One of my favorite ones is Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, edited by Elijah Hickson and Peter Gurry. There's some other books as well I'd recommend. If you want a resource list on textual criticism, feel free to send me an email at jonathan@talkaboutdoubts.com and I'll send you a book list. I also like Wesley Huff's material. He has a good YouTube channel where he does some good stuff speaking about textual criticism. But in brief, we have multiple lines of transmission that converge upon a substantially common text. And we have what we call free or uncontrolled transmission, where there's no governing authority that imposes a textual uniformity upon the text of the New Testament. Unlike with, say, Islam, where you have Uthman ibn Affan in the 650s that imposes a textual uniformity upon the text and burns up the variant manuscripts. And so you have to essentially take his word for it that he did it correctly. With the New Testament, by contrast, you have these multiple independent streams of transmission that converge on a common text. And you have, and so these manuscripts would be distributed around the, would be geographically distributed around a wide, on a wide scale. And so if you were trying to if you were trying to create a fabrication to add to the New Testament intentionally, it would be quite difficult to do that because you'd have to gather up all these different manuscripts in different parts of the world, and you would have to change them in the same ways without leaving a paper trail. And of course, bear in mind that you also have extensive quotations from the New Testament by the early Christians, and so you would have to also edit their quotations of the New Testament, which are quite extensive. So as far as these are as far as the claim that the New Testament has been substantially transmitted faithfully, that's not really controversial among textual critics. This is pretty well established.
So just to let you know, prior to this lecture earlier in the year, we did a whole session here specifically on that question, which has to do with the subject of textual criticism. That is, how do we move from the manuscripts traditions to modern day translations, and how do we know we have a faithful transmission of that text? That's actually my wife's master's degree touched on aspects of this. If you get a chance, just speak to Nell. She's in the kitchen now, just getting tea and coffee ready now. But you can ask her in more detail about that. And we have some books worthy of consulting here as well on that subject of the science of textual criticism. The common popular notion with respect to the Bible being translated is it was basically one translation made and then a copy of that translation made, and then it's like making a photocopy of a document, and it got progressively more corrupted. And that's not how textual criticism works. It doesn't work like that. A New Testament translation that's done in the year 2024 does not appeal to a King James 1611 version. It doesn't appeal to an earlier. And what it does is they go back to the earliest manuscripts. They actually go back to from which we get a convergence on a Greek New Testament, of which there are two accepted versions. I think it's the Neste Allen and the other one, and that's what they operate from. They operate from a Greek text critical text, which I'll show you on the shelf there, and that's where a New Testament then is worked upon, and that's how textual criticism actually works. So you can chat to Nal about that. Any other questions then about the lecture this evening? Yes, ma'am.
So besides resources like Josephus and Cornelius, what other external resources would be used in order to argue like the validity of the life of Christians, the early Christians, and Jesus?
Okay, so the question, Jonathan, is in addition to Josephus and Tacitus, what other non-Christian sources off the top of your head can you mention that are worthy of consulting regarding the historicity of the Christian faith?
Oh, there's plenty. So you mentioned Josephus. There's also Philo of Alexandria. There's the Jewish Talmud, Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. There's Suetonius. There's Dio Cassius. I could literally talk for a long time about points of historical corroboration in all these sources of the Gospels and Acts. There's also, of course, archaeological evidence. So yeah, there's a lot that one could discuss there.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering. So for these resources, how do we know they are accurate?
Okay, so the question then is, how do we know then that these resources are themselves are accurate? How do we know, for example, that Josephus is an accurate resource? And you know,
Mhm.
if we call into question the integrity of the scriptures, I think it's consistent if you do that to say, well, what about all these other ancient? How do we
Mm.
know that there's reliability there?
Yeah, I mean, Josephus is generally considered to be substantially trustworthy when he's dealing with events that are in proximity to his own time period. He tends to be less trustworthy when he's reaching back, centuries into the past, long before his own time period. But I mean, the points of corroboration that I would adduce from Josephus to corroborate aspects of the Gospels, for example, would be essentially taking the form of undesigned coincidences, where you have really subtle or casual bits of information in Josephus that supply historical backstory for things that we have going on in the Gospels, or vice versa. Just to give one example. So in Mark chapter 6, we have the account concerning the imprisonment of John the Baptist and his ultimate beheading. And according to Mark, also Matthew 14 and Luke 3, but we'll talk about Mark. So Mark tells us that the reason why Herod Antipas has John imprisoned is because of John's persistent complaints against Herod's adulterous affair with his brother Philip's ex-wife Herodias. Now, Josephus tells us about this adulterous affair that Herod had with Herodias. And he tells us that Herod actually also divorced his own previous wife, who went back home to her father, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. This actually caused a war between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law. And Herod lost quite badly. His armies got destroyed, according to Josephus. And actually, scholars generally date that defeat to around 36 AD, which would be some years after the death of John the Baptist. Nonetheless, because it was actually shortly before the death of Tiberius, which was 37. Nonetheless, what's interesting is that Josephus tells us that there was a rumor among the Jewish people that Herod's defeat by his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, was God's judgment upon Herod Antipas for how he had handled the situation with John the Baptist. Now, that makes a lot of sense in light of Mark, because according to Mark, and also Matthew and Luke, the reason why Herod Antipas has John imprisoned is because of John's persistent complaints against Herod's adulterous affair with Herodias, which according to Josephus was the very affair that caused the war that Herod lost in the first place. So it actually fits together, where Josephus actually provides historical backstory that explains what's going on in Mark. Or rather, sorry, Mark provides historical backstory in this case that explains or illuminates what's going on in Josephus. That there was that Herod's adulterous affair, according to Josephus, caused the war with Aretas, which Herod lost, and the Jews blamed Herod's defeat on the way he treated John the Baptist. Whereas Mark says the reason why Herod had John the Baptist in prison is because of John's persistent complaints against Herod's adulterous affair. So the two can't fit together. Josephus actually has a slightly different take on the motivation for having John imprisoned. According to Josephus, it was because of Herod's suspicious tempers. We have an uprising. John's getting too popular. The people seem ready to do anything he should advise, so he has John locked up to get him out of the picture. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive motivations. It could be both. It does point to the independence of those sources, of course. It is interesting to note that Luke 8:3 mentions one of Jesus' female disciples that followed him out of Galilee was Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And so the evangelist, therefore, could have some insider scoop regarding Herod and his personal conversations and motivations and that sort of thing. So hopefully you can see how the accounts fit together. And there are scores of these that we could talk about.
Yeah, so we can look at these documents in some sense and pay attention to what's been said there. And sometimes it's issues that are seemingly irrelevant just in the course of discussion. But then you'll find another source which will be speaking about another event, and will just in the course of its account mention something else, and then those things corroborate something in another text. And that isn't what happens when you're colluding to do something. Okay. And this is why these undesigned coincidences are so significant as a way of evaluating the authenticity of some of these historical documents. And you can do that both in the New Testament, but in other ancient documents as well. And this is an instrument by which historians can often test to see whether these sources are authentic or not. It is also true, though, that when you're speaking to scholars, particularly skeptical scholars, and I've spoken to students like this, that very often they take no issue with the historicity of a lot of these non-Christian sources in any way, shape, or form. They're selectively skeptical about the New Testament documents. And when you ask them to justify that kind of selective skepticism, they very often can't answer the question. And I've done this before when we were in Italy doing evangelism, speaking to students at the University of Rome who were studying history. I pointed this out to them. I said to them, how do you justify your selective skepticism here? You all believe in Josephus's account, and Josephus makes mention of very many of the people in the New Testament. You believe in all those things and what he says there, but yet when you consider the New Testament accounts, you kind of rubbish them. How do you justify that? And that shows you that their bias and their skepticism is grounded in something else, not in rigorous historical analysis. There's something else at work there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Are there other religions that also have like a resurrection story that people can think about?
So the question is, are there any other religions who have a resurrection story akin to something like within the Christian faith?
No, not like the resurrection in the Christian faith. Incidentally, if you want a good book on the subject of comparing the evidential merits of Christianity to other religious systems as far as miracles are concerned, and putting forward a set of religiously neutral criteria for evaluating this sort of thing, I recommend John Douglas's book, The Criterion. He lays out 3 criteria, namely, so these are exclusion criteria. So if it meets one of these criteria, it's perhaps not best place to start your investigation, namely if the first reports concerning the alleged miracle occur long after the event is supposed to have taken place. Number 2, if the first reports concerning the alleged miracle are geographically distant from where the event is supposed to have taken place. And number 3, if the alleged miracle is confirmatory of beliefs and practices already established, because he points out that it's a lot easier for a miracle to go to receive a pass without examination if it's confirmatory of beliefs and practices already established in the cultural milieu than it is to establish a new set of beliefs and practices. And of course, the Christian resurrection establishes a new set of beliefs and practices, changing from Sabbath observance to Sunday worship, for example, which there the Christians call the Lord's Day, and so forth. There's a lot of new practices were adopted. William Paley also has a good discussion of this subject in his View of the Evidence of Christianity, which I recommend reading as well.
Right. I told you he's thought of everything. Yes. Right. All right, Jonathan, we're just going to turn you around now so that you can see this beautiful audience that you've been.
Your camera's off at the moment.
Yeah, just hang on a sec. How do we turn the camera on here now? Right. Let me just see if I can unclick this. Can you see me now?
I can.
All right. So I'm a bit ugly, but this crowd is beautiful. So there's your audience for this evening. So good evening to Dr. McClatchy. We had a good crowd in this evening, and I know that they will all very much appreciate that. And I think we should invite him out to South Africa so that you can have longer time to allow him to take you through all this material and ask all your questions. You're going to have to come visit us again, Jonathan, nice and soon.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah,
absolutely.
that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Do send our regards to the Discovery Institute, to John West, Casey, and all the team there. Tell them we appreciate all the work they're doing and the training they're giving to our students all across the country. And we hope to see their teams here in South Africa nice soon. We had Dr. Weikart here recently with Brian Miller and Casey, and they did a brilliant tour here, had a real impact. And so we're looking for another team to come and visit us soon.
Awesome.
All right,
Very
then.
cool.
Well, let's say thank you and cheers to Dr. McClatchy.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jonathan. God
See you later.
bless.
You too.